Entering the ancient Aegean. This is known as the Bronze Age, and the Aegean is the part of the Mediterranean Sea found between Greece and Turkey. It has three separate civilizations, as you can see outlined on your lecture guide number 4. The Cyclades, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean. What do we have to say about the first of these groups as an overview? The Cyclades, a group of about 30 small islands in the southwestern part of the Aegean. The Greeks called these Kyklos. Kyklos meant circle in Greek. And they imagined this Kyklos around the sacred island of Delos, site of Apollo's primary sanctuary and site of worship. The idea of the Kyklos resolved through various political cycles, through democracy, through aristocracy, through monarchy. These islands, these Cycladic islands, are really rich in minerals like iron, copper, gold, silver, obsidian. Obsidian is what is used to buff the statues that we'll see in the Cyclades period. A lot of archaeological evidence. There were early Neolithic settlements. They were settlers who cultivated grains like barley and wheat. And of course, they were fishermen. They had tuna fish then. And they were also very accomplished sculptors in stone. When we look at some of the structures that we'll see, particularly as we get to the end of this period, looking at structures, Mycenaean or otherwise known as Helladic ones, how do we compare them? These, let's say, the bee tomb of Tholos to what we see in an earlier time in Egypt. What are the differences here in monumental architecture? The Cycladian period, being one of 3 civilizations, has another 3 element attached to it, and that we see here, as we have previously, more representations of the human form. Secondly, monumental architecture. And third, an interest in naturalism that begins in about the 3rd millennium of this period and grows and is flourishing by the time we get to Greece, which is our next chapter and week. Before we get into the Cycladic Islands, I'm going to introduce the myth of Europa and the bull, represented by many master paintings through the ages. Here we see Titian's painting of this myth. I wonder how many of you have heard of this. You may have heard of the Minotaur, the resulting progeny of the union of Europa and the bull. But is it fiction? Is there an element of truth in it? What is the story of Zeus and Europa? One of the things it does is demonstrating that Greek gods are like humans, certainly not unlike them. Zeus is lustful. The story goes that the bull Zeus in his bull form, again, we are in a time and place where there is interchangeability between human and an animal, and sometimes godlike, as in this case, forms, as we saw in Egypt. The bull, Zeus in his bull form, kidnaps, and he takes away the Phoenician princess Europa to Crete. And remember that Greek culture, when we get there, is an amalgam, a mixture of many cultures in the Mediterranean. A few other things to say about Europa. She was the mother of King Minos of Crete. Again, she's Phoenician. And she is also the individual, the woman, after whom the continent of Europe was named, Europa. This story, myth, fable of her abduction by Zeus in the form of a bull, a white bull, was a Cretan story. A Cretan story that, as one art historian has pointed out, was one that, while most of the love stories concerning Zeus originated from more ancient tales describing his marriages with goddesses, none was more paramount than the story of Europa. In this story or myth, Zeus assumes the form of a bull, and he coaxes Europa to climb onto his back. He then rides into the sea and carries her to Crete, where he reveals his true identity to her. Europa becomes the first queen of Crete, and she has 3 children with Zeus. This Titian painting, as mentioned, along with others, there is a beautiful Rembrandt of the abduction of Europa. I'll document this story that is one of the most dominant ones in the mythology of this age, and one that we'll visit a little bit later on in our slideshow. Let's take a quick look at the Cycladic Islands today. Very pretty, huh? Beautiful vacation spot. That whitewashing topped by blue, Orthodox Christian minarets, fences, whatever, is very typical of the Greek islands in general. Some basic information about trade, social life, geographical layouts, division of labor, agriculture, herding, marble quarrying. Early on, we see some clay figures made of rather inferior clay, just about the polar opposite of porcelain, which is about the finest clay with which you can work. And what sorts of things did we see made of that clay that was buffed with the sharp stone obsidian, which could be mined here, as well as the marble that came after that? Your basic representations, once again, human, animals, domestic and ceremonial vessels, other types of wares, as we can call them. And a lot of early Cycladic sculpture is comprised of mainly female figures, ranging from really simple stones to more developed ones. Many look as if they have natural proportions, and others are somewhat more idealized. And some of these, of a type that is called speedos, display this remarkable consistency and symmetry in form and proportion that suggests that they were actually planned, that their structure was planned with a compass. What are we looking at here? A Cycladic figure, obviously, figure of a woman as it appears on your lecture guide. How does this differ, this form, from others we have studied, such as the prehistoric Venus of Willendorf? Or in the Egyptian period, Menkaure and his wife? What stylistically is different? What is different in terms of materials in the way these sculptures are made? When we get to the second sculpture on our Cycladic lecture guide, the head with painted decoration, what are we looking at here? Is this part of a ritual scarification in this really marvelous head that is also when it is juxtaposed with objects from different cultures, such as oceanic and African, provides such a remarkable example of the way humans conceive of the idea of three-dimensional representation through sculpture. This head, as you can see, bears traces of paint on it. Again, is this meant to symbolize some sort of a scarification? This is one of Brancusi's. He made several sleeping muses, mid-20th century. An interesting comparison to the cyclitic head. Again, sculpture started off with poor quality clay. We find these predominantly female forms in tombs. And again, there's this idea of proportion suggesting perhaps the use of a compass in their composition. Other examples of Cycladic sculpture from this period. When we get to talking about Crete, the Minoan culture, civilization, it's important to note that the materials on this particular lecture guide, more than others, are really subject to much speculation. There are bits and pieces of information that we have from archaeologists, from excavations, from digs, but it's a bit difficult to compose a clear picture, a verified picture of certain parts of that civilization. There was a major earthquake, volcano, that wiped out much of that civilization. So when we see items such as Linear A, with its undecipherable language loosely based on Egyptian hieroglyphics, it remains mysterious, and it is implicitly tied to archaeology. And we are dependent, in a sense, on archaeologists, the earliest of which, and the most typical of which in this region, Sir Arthur Evans, found, and just as importantly, how he interpreted it, and how we, in a different day and age, might unpack, as they say, or take apart some of that science and theory in terms of understanding this culture and interpreting these ancient materials. Much of what we know about Crete, it depends on Harold Evans, who purchased land, bought island on Crete, and then proceeded to excavate where he believed a great palace once stood. There we see him there, and there he is with the bull's Rhython, which we'll get to a little bit later in Minoan civilization. Arthur Evans, who called this culture Crete Minoan after King Minos, the Minotaur. His division of Old Palace and New Palace periods is fundamental to the way that we were given to understand this period of time. There's also the question that we ask of many, not just archaeologists, but historians and art historians today. Are they correctly practicing? What does that mean? What goes down in the history books and in the archaeological records that is completely composed of evidence, or partially, or even more so, composed of interpretation? Evans had read very closely Homer's Iliad that describes war between the Greeks and the Trojans. He unearthed some remains of a very large palace complex. This is Knossos. But he restored it. This is not unlike when an art conservationist working on the restoration of a master period painting perhaps does too much, perhaps makes it a bit too pretty, perhaps even adds a tiny element that was not 100%, with 100% certainty that we could say existed there before. What Evans did was to insert columns and to restore frescoes. He used reinforced concrete and other materials to do this, not considered a kosher, a good practice in archaeology today. When we look at the plan for Gnosis, we see this complex series of spaces, courtyards, storage areas, areas dedicated just to storage, ceremonial spaces, and of course residential ones. When you look at this plan, just consider the placement of all those various sites and their functionality. It looks, or at least Evans thought so, that a bit like a maze. So Evans decided that this maze, in fact, looked a lot like the labyrinth of the mythic Minotaur, the mythic beast. What is the story of King Minos? Offspring of Zeus and Europa, one of those three children who were born after Europa followed Zeus on his back to Crete. The Minotaur, which is this result of mating with a bull, is seen on one level as a monster, a corruption of humankind that needs to be destroyed. The Greeks, on the other hand, later on, will see humankind as the measure of all things. This combination, though, of animal and human is seen at this time as being barbaric and base. And in this myth, it is the job of Theseus to destroy the Minotaur. Before I quickly tell you that story, I will note that while we might dismiss Evans and his interpretation of Gnosis as being a place for the reenactment of the labyrinth of the Minotaur, you have to admit that we do see an awful lot of bulls in the art of this period, and the objects of this period, as well as some others. Certainly, if we go back to, remember, our earliest prehistoric times, the Hall of Bulls. And in a really wacky interpretation of that, is that just because Evans was certainly not pre-selecting, but in some way privileging, as we say in critical theory now, bulls over perhaps another kind of animal, a human fawn, a human deer, something that in some sense would be competitive with Minos, just an wacky off their thought. Minos competed with his brothers to rule after he ascended the throne of Crete, of the island Crete. And Minos prayed to Poseidon, the sea god, to send him a snow-white bull, the Cretan bull, as a sign that he was supported. Sidebar here, Evans named Minoan culture, of course, after King Minos, who ruled from Gnosis, the complex we're looking at. The Minotaur has the head of a man and the body of a bull. As the poet, the Roman poet later on described the Minotaur, was part man and part bull. As a rather ferocious beast and being a natural offspring of a woman and a bull, the Minotaur had no natural source of nourishment, and thus he devoured humans for sustenance. After getting advice from the Delphic oracle, right, sort of a godhead, Minos had Daedalus construct a gigantic labyrinth to hold the Minotaur, and the location for this in this storyline that Evans recreates for us is near Minos's palace in Gnosis, in this complex. The tail end to this story is that after Minos, who again had competed with his brothers to rule, prayed to Poseidon, the sea god, to send him a white bull as a sign of support, and he did so. Minos' job to show honor to Poseidon, the sea god, a deity, a god, was to kill the bull after receiving it. But it was so beautiful, he decided to keep it. And he thought Poseidon would not care if he kept this beautiful white bull, and instead sacrifice one of his own instead, as homage, as an offering to the god Poseidon. Poseidon didn't think so. And in retribution, in order to punish Minos for this disrespect, he made Pasiphae, Minos' wife, fall deeply in love with the bull. These people were clever, at least in their story construction. As it goes, Pasiphae had Daedalus make a hollow wooden cow, and climbed inside it in order to mate with the white bull. Their offspring was this monstrous minotaur. None of this you have to know or memorize, but it gives you an idea of how these stories were crafted in their age, and how when Evans came along, he picked up on this and made it part, in a sense, of his own mythology of this place in this time. The story of Homer's The Iliad, one of the most famous poems that we have for posterity, is one that discusses the siege of Troy by Greek states. Going back to the temple, we see here this really beautiful architectural realization of what is known as the East Wing stairwell. Here's another detail. And here we have the citadel of Sargon as a comparison to the Knossos Palace. How do we characterize a citadel? What is it? Just by looking at it, we can see it looks like a military complex. It is a fortress. When we regard these two very different kinds of citadels, complexes, what do we see on the right? This is Hatshepsut's temple. In comparison, Knossos was what? It's less hierarchical in a sense. It doesn't have the same variation of scale that Hatshepsut has with the ramps. Knossos was more open. It didn't have the same kind of defensive walls. This prompts historians to conjecture that the culture was more open, less militaristic. Here's some examples of what we find inside this very large structure, kind of a little mini city unto itself, the Knossos Palace. Here we have this, I find it marvelously fanciful fresco of a bull jumping in Knossos. What was this? Was it recreation? Was it ritual? When we look at some of the interpretations, were they ritualistic? Were they just animal husbandry? Were they heroic tales? Again, particularly in the Minoan period, because of these gaps that are sometimes filled in with, not faulty, but less concrete archaeological, no pun intended, documentation than we would like, there's a bit of a mysterious element to the objects and artwork of this period. We also see, in terms of human depictions, sometimes this coloration that is lighter skin than we have seen, certainly during the Egyptian period. Looking here at the harvester vase, what do we see? It's a rather small carved stone, not ceramic container. And we see this registry, like not quite the registers that we saw in Egyptian times, of human forms carrying tools, bearing sheaths of grain, of wheat. What exactly are their facial expressions? Are they laughing? Are they smiling? It doesn't seem certainly to be aggressive. It seems a straightforward depiction of agricultural activity. The bull's head rhyton, uncovered by Evans. What do we see here? Incised, carefully carved on the forehead. And those incisions are filled in with white ground stone, which enhances the details of it and the curly hair of the bull. Very precise and fine work, as well as the details around its snout. What is a rhyton? It's a hollowed out object. It's a vessel. Usually at the base, there's a hole, there's an aperture that's filled with liquid, often wine, and then the wine is poured into the mouth. How do we compare this to a different kind of a vessel? This is a lyre from Sumer. When we get to the octopus flask, one of my favorites, here we see this small container, it was rather small, for water, a narrow opening for drinking. Because it was a clay vessel, it would keep the water cool. And what is the significance of the octopus here? How could we conjecture within the mind frame, within the structure of this civilization, the meaning of the octopus? Certainly it symbolized wealth, food, major food source. These people are sea worshippers on the Aegean. Sometimes protection, which is right, an apparent way of thinking about the octopus's enveloping arms. And as with all Minoan art, it's this idea of closely observing nature and turning it into decoration on objects. When we get to the flotilla fresco, we see this image of island residents just watching boats. It's a seascape of sorts. There are dolphins present. That's not supernatural. It doesn't include kings. It does have this attention to landscape and natural forms. When we see inclusions of things like an olive tree, for example, in these kinds of frescoes, it's hard we can't really be certain whether it was a sacred grove or simply one where the labor of agriculture, of harvesting, was occurring. Again, was something heroic, or was it just herding when we see humans and animals in combination? In summary here, even with Evan's rather single-minded interpretation of Minoan culture, we see definitive patterns, recognizable ones, in the art and the architecture, and again, this attention given to natural forms and landscape, and depicting animals, especially bulls, in very natural ways. And what we don't see is what? humans or human god animal form of rank, which in the last period, the Egyptian we looked at, was certainly far more present, if not omnipresent, present everywhere.